Hey guys, it's Christy and welcome back to my channel. Thank you so much for joining me. Today we're going to be reviewing the all-new Anastasia Beverly Hills Cosmos palette. So before we get into it, I hope you'll consider subscribing to my channel before you leave. Give this video a thumbs up if you enjoy, and let's get into it. So, full disclosure, I have already filmed this video once, just to find out that all of my footage was corrupted. So this is not a first impressions, but I still wanted to film a review. So this is the new Cosmos palette from Anastasia Beverly Hills. This has a 12-month shelf life and is made in the USA. This is the outer carton. I actually really love the design. It's not as textured as some of her most recent palettes, but I am loving it. I love the baby blue with the gold detailing. I just think it's really pretty. This also retails for $55 US. Here is the inner palette, and this is the inside. I think it is so beautiful. I have been seeing a lot of posts about people getting theirs shattered. Fortunately, that did not happen to me. Mine is all in one piece, thank goodness. So today we are going to be doing two different looks and looking at some comparisons toward the end. I have already primed my lids with the Ultra Ego eyeshadow base and set it down with my Dior Powder No Powder. And typically whenever I'm using an ABH palette, I do not do my base makeup first, but I'm just gonna risk it today. So for the first look, I think I really am dying to play with this blue super cluster shade right up here, and I am thinking of making it pretty smoky with this Galaxy shade, which is absolutely out of my comfort zone, but I just want to try it out anyway. But the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take the shade Space Dust, and I'm going to put this one in the crease. This is a shade I think in the palette that's going to get the most use, just because it is one of those perfect warm browns that is in every single one of their palettes, but that works very well as a transition shade for my skin tone. And I am just building this up a little bit more than I normally would, just because I know we're going in pretty deep. And I think I'm going to take the shade Eclipse right here, and I'm going to use this one to begin darkening the outer corner. This shade almost has like a purpley base to it, and I probably don't need this given that I am going to go in with the Galaxy shade, which is kind of like a matte black with a navy blue sparkle. It is a beautiful shade, but if you're familiar with my channel, I do not use black eyeshadow ever. So this is a new one for me. So I'm finding the mattes work very well together. They're very blendable. They do seem to be typical ABH mattes. I will say there is still a lot of kick up like they are known to have, but I honestly don't think they are as powdery as they usually are, if that makes sense. I know the metallics are still very soft and for a lot of people not safe for transit, but the mattes seem to be a little bit harder pressed than they typically are. So I am just going to very slightly dip into Galaxy, and I'm just going to very slightly start packing this on the outer corner, very slightly, because this shade is incredibly pigmented. I learned that yesterday. So I do feel like with this palette you're going to be able to do two very different things. You're going to be able to create a very deep smoky look, but you're also going to be able to create very light, very ethereal, almost watercolor kind of looks, if that makes sense. So they can definitely look almost pastel, but this is a palette that if you really want to make it deep and smoky, you're absolutely going to be able to do that. See, this is very smoky for my preferences. I would not choose to do this on a regular day. I typically never go for a smoky look, and I don't think that will ever be my thing. But I really just want to show you what this palette can do. Okay, I am going to take a brush into Super Cluster. Typically I would do these shades with a finger, but I do want to see what a brush can do. I do want to see if it minimizes any of the fallout. So I'm going to take Super Cluster all over the lid. And in the light, this shade is so fascinating. In the palette, it looks very blue, but in the light, it is like a green shift. It is such an interesting shade. And it meshes so well with Galaxy, because Galaxy already has that dark navy sparkle to it. So Super Cluster really pulls the navy sparkle out of Galaxy, and Galaxy really pulls the blue out of Super Cluster. It is such an interesting and beautiful shade. So even though I do still have a lot of fallout, I do still think this is a very pretty look. For the sake of showing you as many shades as possible, I'm going to take the shade Quasar on a brush and use this one on the inner corner. I actually had to look up how to say that one. And so this shade has like a green gold kind of shift. The duochromes in this palette are beautiful. All right, and that is look number one. It's not a look I'm gonna go to regularly by any means, but I really just love how Super Cluster and Galaxy meet, and I love the effect they have together. I just thought that was so cool when I tried it for the first time. Typically I wouldn't have used Quasar in the inner corner, but again, I just want to show you as many shades as possible. So I did do that for this one. The other eye is going to be much lighter. Let's get into look number two. And this one is sort of borrowed from a look I found on their Instagram, but I am going to start with Space Dust once again. So in some ways, I do think this palette is very unique to my collection, and it kind of is. I mean, if you're familiar with my channel, I am a neutral lover. I wear neutrals most of the time, and I'm happy with that. But I do love playing with color once in a while. When I do, it's usually pink or green or purple. But I do like challenging myself once in a while too. I'm going to take the shade Orion, and this is a pink with a gold sparkle to it. It's a really interesting shade. It's very beautiful. And I'm going to pack this on the inner portion of the lid, dragging it just above the crease. And I think this is such a pretty shade. I love the way that gold sparkle is kind of bold. This would give more impact with the finger for sure, but I'm really trying to get a lot of control with this look, which is why I'm trying so hard to use brushes. Next, I'm gonna grab a little bit of Supernova, which is like a pinky purple shift. I think if you put a black base under this one, like say Galaxy or Dark Matter, the shade would be insane. Okay, I'm gonna pack this one on the inner corner and up just a little bit. So this shade itself has a bit of a translucent base, and it reminds me a lot of a shade that is in the Huda Beauty Rose Quartz palette. The Huda shade is more textured and has a bit more of a base, whereas this one, it's a little bit more translucent and is really going to depend on what you have underneath it. Next, I'm going back into Quasar, and I'm trying to get the shape that I want with this one. Okay, so I'm gonna grab a bit more of Supernova, and I'm actually just gonna grab it on a finger this time, and I'm gonna pat it over that pink because I think it's gonna look really cool with Quasar that way, having the two duochrome side by side. Okay, just grabbing a clean brush. Okay, so here are the final two looks, and I like them both in different ways. So this look, I love that I used the black. I love that I was brave and used the black. I love the way it works with Super Cluster. I think the effect was really cool overall, and I like it, and I kind of like that it has that depth. However, on this side, I don't know if it's coming off on camera how cool it actually looks to have two different duochromes on the eye. I like that there is minimal depth. You know, I like this eye for the exact opposite reasons. I like this one. This one I like because it has depth. This one I like because it doesn't. And it really just depends on what you're going for, what you're into. But if you're somebody who is worried that you wouldn't be able to get depth with this palette, you definitely can. But if you're looking to get into more of that very lightly pigmented watercolor kind of look, I totally think you can do that too. This palette is really pretty. I really like it. There are 4 duochrome shades in here. Super Cluster, Sun, Quasar, and Supernova are all these duochrome shades. they have somewhat of like a translucent base to them, so that what you put underneath is really going to affect the shade. Like Super Cluster, for example, I have nothing under it over here. You can see the blue, but in the light you can also see the green. But where it sits on top of Galaxy, it looks very, very blue. Supernova, I think you could put this over top of a pink and have just a really shifty pink. If you put it over top of a purple, you're gonna get a really cool purple look. Just on the lid itself, it's pretty, but like I said, it doesn't have the impact that like a Huda Beauty shadow would have. The Quasar, very cool. It's like a green with a gold shift. It's beautiful. The mattes are the standard mattes that come in ABH palettes. They're very good. They're easy to work with. They're very blendable. And I'm sure these two shades are in pretty much every single ABH palette. Mercury, I want to play with a little bit more. That shade intimidates me a little bit, but I do want to play with it a bit more. Dark Matter, I have also not played with, but when I swatched Dark Matter, it was very, very dry. So these mattes here feel buttery to the touch, whereas Dark Matter did not. It felt very, very dry to the touch, and it swatched terribly. Let's look at some comparisons. So the first one we will look at is Nouveau palette. So the only reason that I thought of looking at these together is because they are both fairly neutral palettes with a pop of color. Nouveau definitely pulls a lot more green, whereas Cosmos has some pinks and purples and of course bright blues. So for that reason, they're not identical, but they are sort of similar, if that makes sense. Another palette I decided to pull, and this is just to really compare the duochrome shades, is the Natasha Denona Mini Pastel. So I will pop up a photo of swatching some of these side by side. So the pink shade in the Natasha palette kind of reminded me a little bit of Orion. This gold shade kind of lined up with this one. This blue sort of lined up with Super Cluster. It wasn't identical, but I do think if you have the Mini Pastel and a neutral palette, you could totally make very similar looks. Another palette that this reminds me a lot of and might not be a perfect dupe is the Huda Beauty Mercury Retrograde. So very, very similar kind of vibe in my opinion. You're getting a lot of neutral shades, but you're getting some of these celestial type shades as well. The pinks kind of match up a little bit, the browns, the shifty golds. So while they're not shade for shade dupes, there are definitely some similarities, but overall I think if you have Mercury Retrograde, I think you could probably skip on Cosmos, quite honestly, because I think you're going to get a very similar vibe. I also will say the Huda palette definitely has a lot more impact. The textures in the Huda are a lot more special, so I will mention that as well. I did pull out Rose Quartz, even though they're not identical, but what I wanted to look at was the shade Supernova and Moon Magic in the Rose Quartz. And again, we run into that issue where the ABH is very, very smooth, but kind of has a translucent base, whereas the Huda palette is definitely a lot more textured, but it is so much more impactful. That being said, I think if you're somebody with very textured lids and you can't stand overly foiled eyeshadows, or you just find them unflattering, you would probably prefer the ABH formula because it is so much smoother, whereas Huda has always been the queen of texture. I also pulled out the Pat McGrath Celestial Odyssey palette from Holiday because a lot of these duochrome shades, they're not identical, but you can get a similar impact. Pulling out the Celestial Nirvana from this past holiday and looking at it with the ABH, I mean, there really isn't duochromes in here, but I think you can still get a very similar vibe. They're not identical, of course, but I think if you have all of these palettes that I mentioned, you probably don't need Cosmos. At the end of the day, I think the person who preferred this palette is somebody who leans neutral like I do, but likes a pop of color every now and then. I think you would really enjoy this because you can just wear some of these metallics and duochromes on their own, and that's a full look. I think if you're somebody who loves bright, bold, colorful eyeshadows, this won't be it, because I do think there are much more impactful shades on the market. You know, there are indie brands who can do duochromes even better. I think the ABH is good. I think it's very pricey, but I think it's good. I just think it kind of caters to a very specific audience, in my opinion. I do think it's pretty. I do think it's a little bit different for the brand, which I love. But again, I think it's gonna, like I said, cater to those people who very much lean neutral but are looking to dip their toes into color, and maybe people who do not like a lot of texture on their lids, because these shimmers are very, very smooth. I will say that. Overall, I think it's a really nice palette. Based on some posts I've seen, I would probably not recommend ordering it online. I would definitely recommend purchasing it in store. I think if you're interested in it, grab it. I think you'll like it. But if you're kind of on the fence, I would maybe pass again, especially if you have some of these other palettes that I mentioned, because you could probably still create very similar looks. But that is it for me today. Let me know down below if you're planning to pick this one up. Did you already? Let me know all of your thoughts down below. I love hearing from you guys so much. If you're new here, I hope you'll consider subscribing before you go. I do upload at least 3 new videos every single week. Thank you again so very much for watching, and I will see you in my next one. Bye!